No fish oil is getting past you, right? So you're picking up the bottle. What exactly are you looking for? What dosing are you looking for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So on the back of each fish oil, a commercially available fish oil will have around 30% of EPA plus DHA. So that's generally what is normally on the shelves. You can get higher quality and higher grade. So what I typically look for is the EPA and DHA content. So what you will often see is them expressed in something called milligrams on the back of, say, it's the bottle. And if you're looking to get 500 milligrams per day, what you can do is you can look at the back and it'll either say per serving or per one soft gel or 1 gram of soft gel, how much you get. And for myself, I would typically, if anything starts to get below 30% is when I become concerned. And you'll notice that a lot of the cheaper products typically have EPA and DHA content of that fish oil product that is lower than 30%. So typically it's just that we go for things that are like around 30% or higher for the fish oil product of EPA plus DHA.
Thank you to Timeline for sponsoring this episode of the show. With all of this discussion about mitochondrial health and how it becomes damaged as we age and how important it is for energy generation, it's critical and imperative to take care of the health of our mitochondria. Today, you heard all about omega-3 fatty acid. I'm here to tell you that MitoPure makes an incredible urolithin A. It is the purest and first only clinically tested form of the potent postbiotic urolithin A, which has been shown in multiple trials to support mitochondrial health and even improve endurance and strength in individuals. Again, if you care about a muscle-centric lifestyle, then you definitely want to be on board with MitoPure. Head on over to timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon, and you will get 10% off your order. That's timelinenutrition.com/Dr. Lyon. Dr. Chris McGlory, you are an assistant professor at Queen's University, and you completed a postdoctoral fellowship at McMaster University under the supervision of the one and only Dr. Stu Phillips. I'm really excited to have you on the show today because your work in omega-3 fatty acids and skeletal muscle health and essential amino acid intake to protect against muscle disuse atrophy is extraordinary. You really are leading and paving the way. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks very much, and thanks for the nice introduction. I think I'm taking a lot of credit there for other people's work as well, but very much a team effort in the human trial. So yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting a little bit about some of the work that we've done and some of the work that we're looking to do now.
So excited. So let's dive into it. Can you give us a little bit of background, how you arrived at your current research?
Yeah, sure. So I'm from the UK. I'm based in Canada, but I did my undergraduate and master's degrees at Liverpool John Moores University, which is probably the best sports science institute in the world, at least in my opinion. And I did it with Graham Close and James Morton. And both Graham and James are very interested in carbohydrate metabolism and sports performance. And, I did a little bit of work there. And then I was really fascinated by protein metabolism and learning how muscle proteins turn over. So James recommended I work with somebody in that field, such as Stuart or Luc van Loon in Holland. But I was very lucky to land a PhD studentship with Kevin Tipton at the University of Stirling, and my intention really was to go up there and learn how to use stable isotope traces to measure muscle protein turnover after exercise. But when I got up there, Kevin and my other supervisor, Stuart Galloway, had landed a grant to look at how omega-3 fatty acids would interact with protein metabolism in the context of feeding omega-3 fatty acids and seeing how it affected muscle protein metabolism. And it kind of piqued my interest. So we did a series of studies in Stirling. And then at the same time, we were collaborating with Dr. Stuart Phillips' lab at McMaster because Stuart had the mass specs that allowed us to measure the isotope enrichment in our sample. So I went to Canada for a couple of weeks and worked there with the crew in Mac. And then when I got back to Stirling, Stuart had kindly offered me the opportunity to go and learn from him a little bit more of the clinical work in the form of a postdoc. So I went to McMaster and I spent, I'd say, 5 of the best years of my career with Dr. Phillips, learning lots about the clinical work and applying stable isotopes. And Stu was also a very excellent mentor and allowed me to work with other people such as Graham Holloway and learn from them in the surrounding area. And then a job came up at Queen's University in Canada just before the pandemic. I applied and I got the job, and then the rest is history, really, at least with the pandemic. And it's only now that we've really started to get some of the trials that I'm sure we'll talk about today up and going.
Yeah, I'm really excited. And, my audience is fascinated in the idea of muscle centric medicine from our perspective. And I can speak collectively for my audience. We are very focused on the health of skeletal muscle as it relates to aging, longevity, metabolism, glucose homeostasis. And protecting skeletal muscle is really at the forefront of all of our thoughts, especially as aging and with the continuation of the narrative of really just focused on obesity, but bringing it back
Yep.
to skeletal muscle health, which again, I think that you've done some tremendous work. Can you talk, number one, I would like for the audience to understand a little bit, nothing in great detail about the stable isotope tracers so they can get a sense of putting into context some of the work. Just very briefly.
Yeah, briefly. So, as cut long story short, is that when you want to look at how your muscle grows, you need to be able to measure it, and you can either use imaging techniques, such as an MRI, but that takes typically weeks, sometimes months, to see the change in muscle growth and response, or muscle loss in response to an intervention. By using a stable isotope, essentially a stable isotope, it labels amino acids. It makes them a little bit heavier chemically, which allows us that when we take muscle biopsies and we take blood samples, we can look at the fate of the ingested amino acid. So, for example, if you have an amino acid or a particular food source that is more anabolic than another, when we take muscle biopsies, we will see what we call a greater level of enrichment, which means more of that isotope in the muscle. And we use mass spectrometry to assess that, which is an extremely precise and sensitive instrument. So we can actually measure muscle growth using stable isotopes over the period of hours and days instead of weeks and months with the imaging techniques.
That's so fascinating. And I think it's important to point out that typically in practice and when they translate human trials, that the imaging can miss a lot versus the stable isotope is, again, like you said, very precise. You will get even granular detail. Talk to me about what you uncovered about omega-3 fatty acids. Number one, what are omega-3 fatty acids? What are some of the doses that you looked at? What are some of the mechanisms of action? Because again, if we ask a question and we say, well, omega-3 fatty acids may help with muscle protein synthesis as opposed to its effect on muscle breakdown, what are some of the mechanisms of action? And just kind of a broad overview on the omega-3 fatty acids and
Yeah, okay.
how that relates to muscle health.
Sure. And if I start rambling, feel free to
Ah,
interject me because it's
we
something
try
I
not to
kind of find
interrupt,
quite
but
interesting.
sometimes it's helpful.
Yeah, so omega-3 fatty acids are a class of an essential fatty acid, which basically means we need to acquire them in the diet. And essentially, the omega-3s refer to the position of the first double carbon bond. So say a saturated fatty acid, and most fatty acids, they're essentially hydrocarbon chains. And the poly or the unsaturated fatty acid basically means that there's a double carbon bond somewhere in that chain. And these double carbon bonds create a kink in the fatty acid. So instead of having a flat saturated chain, the position of that double carbon bond will create like a bit of a kink in the fatty acid chain. And an omega-3 basically refers to the fact that that kink or that double bond is on the third carbon away from the omega end of the fatty acid chain. Now, a polyunsaturated fatty acid means that there's multiple kinks or multiple double carbon bonds. So, this is where we see the differences between the actions, say, of saturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids in the body. So then some people would say, well, what's the difference between an N3 and an N6? Well, if we go by the extension of that, it's the position on the third carbon, the N6 means that the double carbon bond is on the sixth carbon. And this kind of has a fundamental difference in the body in terms of we believe or we know that the omega-3s serve as precursors or building blocks for the production of anti-inflammatory signaling molecules, whereas the omega-6s serve as the building blocks for some pro-inflammatory signaling molecules. And it's just quite interesting to me that simply moving the position of that first double carbon bond can have such a profound effect on metabolism and at least inflammatory processes in the muscle. In terms of the mechanism of action, aside from inflammation, because that is generally where people focus when we talk about omega-3s. We think of it in terms of having the anti-inflammatory actions, which it does, but we believe that some of the effects in muscle are independent from that anti-inflammatory action, and they could be related more to the structure of the omega-3s, because those omega-3 fatty acids are actually incorporated into our membranes of our cells, and those membranes actually protect the inside of the cell. And when you incorporate those omega-3s into that phospholipid membrane, think of it like a wall protecting the castle. When you kind of incorporate more of those omega-3s, it alters the processes on the membrane, and we believe it alters the processes on the membrane in a favorable way towards skeletal muscle.
That's so fascinating. And you had mentioned N3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, and that's really what we talk about as a PUFA, omega-3 fatty acids. And then you mentioned omega-6 fatty acids. And there's a lot of conversation about that ratio in the current Western diet. In terms of, and I know that in your studies, you have multiple great studies. And the one that I'm looking at here is temporal changes in human skeletal muscle and blood lipid composition with fish oil supplementation. Because again, from a bench to bedside perspective, what we care about is how does this move the needle for the listener and the patients. You gave people 5 grams of fish oil per day for 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Do you think that an individual could someone get that in a diet? And also, could they get that in the appropriate ratio of EPA and DHA? I'd love for you to discuss how you came up with 5 grams of fish oil, how you decided on the EPA, DHA, and then one last question, and I can remind you of any of these questions. What is the minimum to prevent deficiency? Because I don't think that per se, we think of omega-3 fatty acids as a minimum to prevent deficiencies. But I'm curious as if you've thought about that.
Okay, so I'll start with the last question first. So you're correct. The main omega-3 fatty acids are EPA and DHA. And the typical recommendation is to consume 2 oily pieces of fish a week. And that would get you around 1 gram a week, I believe. And that's going to be on top of what your normal diet is. And this is for people without cardiovascular disease risk. And then it changes for people with heart disease, starting off at around 1 gram per day. And that's when people look at supplements. On that note, what I'll say is that people sometimes will conflate fish oil with omega-3 supplements. So what I say is that sometimes you'll see the brand, or not the brand, you'll see it labeled as fish oil, but you look at the back and per gram, you might only have 100 milligrams, which is 1/10 of EPA and DHA, and the rest of it is filler with different fatty acids, monounsaturated fatty acids. So really, I think it's careful for us to kind of talk in the context of EPA and DHA, and not necessarily fish oil. But when we're communicating with the general public, we say fish oil. But that's my disclaimer there. I think what we try to do is we're using omega-3s as a means to kind of understand the regulation of metabolism. So the doses that we use in our studies are not ones that I would suggest the general public should be moving forward with just yet. They're very high doses, around 5 grams.
That's interesting. Wait, but before you go back, what should someone look at? For example, let's say you're going to Whole Foods. I don't know if you have Whole Foods out there, but let's say you're going to one of your health food stores. No fish oil is getting past you, right? So you're picking up the bottle. What exactly are you looking for? What dosing are you looking for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So on the back of each fish oil, a commercially available fish oil will have around 30% of EPA plus DHA. So that's generally what is normally on the shelves. You can get higher quality and higher grade. So what I typically look for is the EPA and DHA content. So what you will often see is them expressed in something called milligrams on the back of, say, it's the bottle. And if you're looking to get 500 milligrams per day, what you can do is you can look at the back and it'll either say per serving or per 1 soft gel or 1 gram of soft gel, how much you get. And for myself, I would typically, if anything starts to get below 30%, is when I become concerned. And you'll notice that a lot of the cheaper products typically have EPA and DHA content of that fish oil product that is lower than 30%. So typically it's just that we go for things that are like around 30% or higher for the fish oil product of EPA plus DHA.
So there's no number of EPA aside from percentage that you're looking for in terms of 800 milligrams.
Well, I would typically look for a combination of EPA plus DHA that comes to 500 milligrams. And that would help, if you are looking to get 500 milligrams per day, which is around what the recommendations are for people without cardiovascular disease, then that's kind of what I would look for to do.
Do you think that that is enough?
Well, I'm going to do the scientist response here and say it depends, and it's all context specific. So, there's recommendations there for healthy people. There's recommendations for people with cardiovascular disease. I don't think, in my opinion, right now we have enough scientific evidence available to make prescription recommendations to improve skeletal muscle health. I'd say it's going to be a few years before we get there, but I think the first thing is, do no harm. And I'm not an RD or a physician, or registered dietitian or physician, so I wouldn't be prescribing anybody anything. But I'd say that there's no real harm in going up to around 2 grams per day of EPA plus DHA, at least from what I've seen in the literature. And there appears to be quite significant benefit if you look at Bill Harris's work with the omega-3 index, that the second you get a little bit higher into those ranges, there seems to be beneficial impacts across the board for health.
And I love that you brought up the omega-3 index, because that is something you guys listening can have your provider do. An omega-3 index is something that can be, you can get that through blood work. Is there a percentage that you like to see in the omega-3 index of omega-3 fatty acids?
Yeah, so I'm careful with this. I mean, in terms of cardiovascular disease risk, off the top of my head, I believe it's around 8% is what people are looking towards, the upper end. In terms of muscle, I am a little bit skeptical when I see people using the omega-3 index as a reference for skeletal muscle health, because I just don't think the evidence is there yet for us to say to protect against or to improve muscle with aging, you need this percentage. But I'd say that using it as a broad gauge for omega-3 status is quite helpful. And again, I haven't familiarized myself with the index for a while now, but I think around 8% is something that is typically a healthy level.
Yeah, I would agree. We like to see people between 8 and 12 or so. Just for overall health, it's a goal that we shoot for. Now, in terms of mechanism of action, let's talk a little bit about the mechanism of action and what the potential benefits are of omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, sure. So are we talking muscle specific?
You can talk
or general?
Whatever you would like. Your
Okay,
favorite topic is what we want to hear about.
So I actually think we don't really know. There's some really interesting papers out there now that I've, and they're review papers by people who've done a lot of work in cardiovascular physiology. And I just think we know that, at least from a cardiovascular perspective, there is some positive evidence there, and some recent trials using Vascepa, which is a kind of pure form of EPA, is showing some positive results in the cardiovascular world. But I still don't think we've nailed down the mechanism, at least in that perspective. When it comes to muscle, the first thing is that I'm now, we do need more work. I need to see a little more high quality RCTs before I'm quite convinced it's beneficial for muscle, but we're going in that direction. I actually think I've got a hunch that it is related to incorporation into the membranes and potentially influencing mitochondria, which are obviously the powerhouse of the cell. They create the energy. And I think there's something related to the incorporation into the membrane, and then also improving mitochondrial health and function, which I know is a very broad term, but that's the kind of overall mechanism that I think from a skeletal muscle perspective might be working. But again, we just need a lot more work in the area before we can really start pinning those mechanisms down.
Thank you to Element for sponsoring this episode of the show. I never go anywhere without my Element. It really helps in a number of ways. Element is a electrolyte solution. It has 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, 60 milligrams of magnesium in multiple different flavors. I mix it with sparkling water. Be careful because it can overflow if you are not paying attention. Here's why I love Element. I'm traveling a ton. I'm also sweating a lot. I know that that's probably too much information, but I'm doing these things that are constantly causing dehydration. and I feel it, whether I get muscle cramps or headaches. I use Element because it really, really helps me personally. I recommend it to my patients. I strongly suggest that you give it a try. You can go over to drinklmnt.com/Dr. Lyon. And when you use my code, you will get a 8 flavor sample pack to try. So that way you can decide what you like and what you don't. But I guarantee you are going to love them all. And Element offers a no questions asked refund. So it's totally risk free. That's fascinating. How does it relate to? So basically, what I'm hearing you say is that this incorporation of taking an omega-3 fatty acid orally will help with the, would you say, the fluidity of the phospholipid membrane of cells potentially?
Yeah, I'd say the order. I've used fluidity before, and I've been reprimanded, and I think it's
Good
because
reprimand. Yes.
fluidity gives it gives the impression that it's just not regulated. Oh, we just make things easier to get in and out. And I think if the analogy of that castle wall is, it's the whole point of a membrane is to protect and to regulate what comes in and out. And I think Dr. Phil Calder, who I spoke to, we wrote a review article on this. He referred to me and said it's actually membrane order, where the order of the membrane and how things are regulated across that membrane is altered. So that's really where I think that the beneficial effects of the omega-3s would occur. And to pick off that, it seems to me at least logical, and there is some evidence for this, that people who have a low omega-3 status would benefit more from omega-3 intake because the composition of their membrane is not as favorable as to those people who typically have an omega-3 index that was, around the 6 to 8%.
How long does it take for the membrane to incorporate omega-3 fatty acids?
Well, that's a function of the dose. So if you give around 5 grams per day of omega-3s, or around 3 to 5 grams per day, you can see a detectable change within about 2 weeks. But it's detectable because we use very precise instruments. It's really a very small increase. But it typically, you require around 4 weeks, 4 to 8 weeks to see about a doubling of the EPA and DHA content in the muscle. And we've shown before in women that are around 5 grams per day of collective omega-3s, that it seems to kind of plateau somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks in the muscle. And what we're doing now is we're doing a study where we're trying to see how long it takes for it to come out of the muscle. So my grad student, Sydney Smart, is doing a study where it's a funny name, Sydney Smart, but she's loading up for 8 weeks and then ceasing intake, and then seeing how long it takes for it to come back down to baseline in the muscle, and measuring associated inflammatory markers to see whether they track the up and down nature of the lipid composition or the EPA and DHA composition in muscle.
That's really exciting. I'm excited to hear what her results are. Is it dose dependent? So you went up to 5 grams. If you were to say go up to 10 grams, I don't know if this has been done in humans or animal models, but if you go up above and beyond the 5-gram dose, do you think that there is diminishing returns?
I would certainly say so, yes. There's going to be a point at which we just cannot assimilate the EPA and DHA into the membranes as quickly. And now I don't know any hard studies on this that has done dose response in skeletal muscle, at least of real high doses of 10 versus 5 versus 2.5. But I'd say that there gets to a point where, a lot of the lipids would just end up being oxidized. They wouldn't make it into the membrane. And I think 5 grams is quite challenging for a lot of people to consume in pill format. You could drop it down to around 2 grams per day of EPA DHA and still see the same changes in the membrane. Potentially, it just may take a little bit longer, maybe 2 to 3 months instead of in the 1 to 2 months that we'd see with a higher dose.
Do you suspect that the needs are a daily need?
Um, I'd say that if we're talking that if we're gonna kind of pin our mechanism of action around changes in the membrane composition, I would say that no, like you could probably skip a day and then pick back up on the omega-3s, and it wouldn't be too much of an issue. I don't think the benefits of the omega-3s are transient. And what I mean by transient, I don't mean that, you take omega-3s, you do exercise, and just taking the omega-3s within hours cause you to, have these beneficial effects, so to speak. I think what happens is the omega-3s will prime the cellular environment to better respond to cues. or to protect against negative cues. So you really do need to increase the EPA DHA content of your muscle before you typically see the benefits.
This leads beautifully into one of your recent research papers that I found very relevant. And this was omega-3 fatty acid supplementation attenuates skeletal muscle disuse atrophy during 2 weeks of unilateral leg immobilization in healthy young women. And I am going to just give you a quick summary for the listener. And you, my friend, are going to dive deep into the literature. So the summary is this study investigated the impact of omega-3 fatty acid supplementation on muscle size, mass, muscle protein synthesis during a 2-week period of muscle disuse and recovery in women. And it's somewhat of the catabolic crisis model that Doug Patton-Jones had initially put together. Participants either consumed 5 grams a day of omega-3 fatty acids or an equivalent amount of sunflower oil as a control group, starting 4 weeks before the immobilization of a limb. The results showed that the decline in muscle volume was significantly lower in the omega-3 group compared to the control group, and muscle mass reduction was only observed in the control group. Of course, there's 2 more statements here. So the muscle protein synthetic response was higher in the omega-3 group, and basically, this takeaway for me was that omega-3 supplementation could help mitigate muscle disuse atrophy in young women, which is fascinating because most of the studies, when we think about disuse, are older, potentially through the promotion of muscle protein synthesis versus the mitigation of muscle protein breakdown or a proteolysis.
Yeah. So I think, that study was kind of a long time in the making. We'd read the papers from Bettina Mittendorfer's group that we talked about before, with Gordon Smith and Sam
Hi,
Klein,
Bettina.
showing that. Yeah, she's
Hi,
listening.
Bettina and Gordon. I was telling Chris that I trained. I was there in my fellowship at my postdoc with Bettina and Gordon Smith. So, hey, guys.
Yeah, they did the classic, the seminal papers in this field at the start, showing that you feed omega-3s and then you infuse with amino acids and insulin, you see a potentiation of protein synthesis. So the omega-3s had somehow, potentiated the feeding-induced response, or the simulated feeding-induced response. And they followed that up, of course, with the longitudinal study in older people, where they fed older people omega-3s and found that it increased muscle volume. So really what we were kind of interested in, and Dr. Phillips has done a lot of work with immobilization and disuse, and trying to understand what are the factors that kind of cause muscle loss with disuse in humans specifically. And it is different between humans and rodents, in our opinion. So I come from Sterling with my PhD, really interested in omega-3 metabolism. And, Dr. Phillips had been doing a lot of work in aging and disuse, and, he supported me, and we wrote grants to get the money into study whether we could use these omega-3s, which were anabolic in situations of just simply feeding, and whether they could protect against disuse atrophy. And we chose young women for a variety of reasons. One, there's some evidence that women can metabolize EPA to DHA a little bit more efficiently. Secondly, young women tend to be more susceptible to ACL injuries when they're playing sport, and therefore, going through a period of disuse. And the literature, at least with protein metabolism, is kind of lacks a lot of data in females. So essentially what we wanted to do is to study whether the omega-3s could protect against muscle loss. And essentially that's what we found. We found that when we feed for a prolonged period, or that run-in period for 4 weeks, put the young women in a leg brace for 2 weeks, and then allowed them to recover for 2 weeks, to going back to their activities of daily living, that those in the omega-3 group seem to lose less muscle than those in the control group. And that this was linked to higher rates of protein synthesis, which gave us a bit of confidence, because we'd seen before the work from Bettina Mittendorfer's lab showing that it directly affects protein synthesis. But there are a couple of disclaimers on this, I would say, is that, this work typically costs a lot of money, so you can't do large sample sizes unless you do get the cash to do so. And we did see around a 14% decline in muscle volume in the control group, which is quite a lot. So whilst this was a very rigorously controlled study, when you see a 14% decline in the control group and around a 5% decline in the intervention group, we typically see around 5% declines in this population with 2 weeks of disuse. So, I'm confident that, there was an effect of omega-3s, at least from the protein synthetic perspective, but we also have to bear in mind that it's certainly not, it's not a complete case at all. I think a lot more work needs to be done in this, and that's what we're trying to do right now. We've gone to a larger bed rest study where we're looking at 40 women, 20 in a control, 20 in an intervention group during a period of bed rest to see whether we can recapitulate those findings.
And what is the age of those young women or the women, the groups?
18 to 30.
18 to 30. So
So
they
they're young
still
women.
have a robust amount of hormones. So that potentially could play a role, yeah?
I'm not too sure that I think I haven't seen convincing evidence that in humans anyway that these changes in circulating hormones actually have too much of a role in regulating muscle protein turnover in young people at all. I mean, as we get older, maybe it's slightly different, but I think primarily it's the intrinsic to the muscle. It's the factors intrinsic to the muscle that are causing muscle loss. And Luke Van Loon's group have done some excellent work with intrinsically labeled protein, where it would suggest, at least to me, that there's intracellular mechanisms that are affecting greater protein synthesis that are causing the muscle loss themselves.
When we talk about the intrinsic mechanism, are you talking about mTOR? Are you talking about um, additional mechanisms? And if so, what is the role of dietary protein? And does that act synergistically with the omega-3 supplementation?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So when I say intrinsic to muscle is basically in humans, to maintenance of muscle size is muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. So again, imagine a brick wall. You put bricks in, which is muscle protein synthesis. You take bricks out, which is muscle protein breakdown. In humans, when we go through a period of disuse, it's the inability to put bricks into that wall effectively, and breakdown pretty much stays the same or slightly increases. And then that's when you see that reduction in muscle size. So really what we believe is happening is that there is a reduction in protein synthesis inside of the muscle. And there seems to be something about the molecular factors inside of the muscle that are altered that impair the ability of muscle to mount that protein synthetic response. And typically we hear mTOR quite a lot, and that is obviously the focus of a lot of research for a variety of reasons right across from aging and cancer and nutrition. I think we really, again, don't know is the answer. We don't know exactly inside of the muscle what is causing that impaired or blunted protein synthetic response, or the reduction in muscle protein synthesis. It could be reductions in the capacity or the amount of translational material that we have, or it could be an impaired ability to translate the protein from the mRNA. But when it comes to the amino acids, yes, I do believe that there's a synergy between the omega-3s and the essential amino acids, particularly leucine. If going back to the classic work that we talked about before in Bettina Mittendorfer's lab, what they found was that when you measure muscle protein synthesis in the fasted state so that there is no feeding, omega-3s don't really seem to have an effect on resting protein synthesis rate. So this is before you've consumed protein or amino acids. But when they infused amino acids, that was when they saw the potentiation. So again, that kind of goes back to my theory about the mechanism of action being it changes the biophysical properties of the muscle so that maybe it's better able to stimulate protein synthesis in response to amino acid feeding, if that kind of makes sense.
It does, and it's so interesting. Basically, what I'm hearing is if you are going to ingest, and again, I'm taking this to the public, if you're going to ingest omega-3 fatty acids, potentially for some kind of muscle sparing effect, it sounds like it's better to do in combination with some kind of dietary protein. Could that be fair?
I would say so, yeah. I'd say that, there's some evidence that it might actually potentiate the small doses. So if you've insufficient your diet in protein, the omega-3s may rescue it a little bit. But I would say that combining omega-3 intake with a high quality protein diet, rich in essential amino acids is probably the way forward. But again, another disclaimer here, as I think there is no more powerful tool than exercise, particularly resistance exercise, to combat muscle loss. So, whenever I give a talk on this, I'm always like, first slide, right? you can't out nutrition physical inactivity. And Dr. Phillips says this a lot, and sort of a few others is, exercise is the frontline strategy here, but then after that, modifications to diet are important. And then when we think of the context of hospital or sickness or surgery, then I think nutrition becomes a greater relative player in the toolbox that we have to try to combat muscle loss.
I couldn't agree with you more. Exercise is a much bigger needle mover, but again, the majority of individuals, 50% of Americans don't exercise. And of those exercising, they might hit 24% of the baseline recommendation. Eating
Yep.
and food intake supplementation is the lowest hanging fruit because it's something that we all do. Nailing this and getting this right is essential. The other side mention of what you're saying is that you do need physical activity, which makes me think in terms of gradation, you are looking at bed rest, which again, this is an extreme model for those of you guys, bed rest is exactly what it sounds like. And typically when someone is admitted into the hospital, oftentimes that is something that is put on their chart. Individuals should be on bed rest, probably the worst thing that you could do for someone's
Yeah.
skeletal muscle health. What about individuals who are not per se exercising and not on bed rest? Is there a minimum amount of movement that you think becomes protective? Or let's say they're taking 1,000 steps a day, 2,000. Do we have an idea of what the minimum effective dose of just maintenance to prevent atrophy? Thank you to Inside Tracker for sponsoring this episode of this show. Inside Tracker has made great strides this year in adding multiple new biomarkers. One that I would love to point out to you is ApoB, which is critical for heart health. We test this in all our patients, as well as 3 hormone markers that are especially important for addressing symptoms related to aging. Inside Tracker has also added insulin, and we've all heard about insulin. And insulin, fasting levels of insulin is a key biomarker for muscle health. And again, these are all things that you should know of. Go to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon. That's insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon. And you will get 20% off the entire Inside Tracker store. Why is blood work so important to do? Because it gives you data. And in order to make good decisions, you have to rely on data. Do not wait. Head on over to insidetracker.com/Dr. Lyon for 20% off their entire store.
I don't think we have an exact prescription in terms of reps, sets, type of exercise, but just to maybe put it into context, low levels of physical activity, and that could be defined as, walking to the shops, walking around, climbing stairs, really have a very protective effect against all-cause mortality. Like if you look at the data there, like doing something is certainly better than nothing. When it comes to muscle, just to give you an idea, some work from Marley Dirks, who worked with Luc van Loon. Now she's got an independent position in Holland. She did work where they just superimposed twitch interpolation. So essentially they got a pad that delivered electrical stimulus onto somebody's leg that was immobilized. And I could be wrong here, so you'd have to check the papers out, but I think it was around 30 minutes a day of just superimposed twitch. And it was enough to prevent the loss of muscle size, but not muscle strength. So I think, it depends on the question. To offset the loss of muscle size, you could probably get away with not that much. I mean, to give you an example, in the bed rest studies, what we're worried about is people getting up and walking around. And you'll see in a lot of the bed rest trials, people have to go to the bathroom in the bed. They make sure that they don't move around a bit because it may protect against the loss of muscle size, but what it does not protect against is a loss of muscle strength. And muscle strength is arguably more important than muscle size when it comes to aging. We want to be able to move functionally, and we require that strength. So essentially, I think anything is better than nothing. If I was to pick one, I'd say resistance exercise training or some form of resistance, because then you're going to hit strength and size. But essentially, the answer is I don't know if what is the minimal amount, but I'd say something is better than nothing for sure. So just basically, if you think, because I'm not going to go to the gym and do an hour session lifting weights, it doesn't mean that you couldn't just go outside and go for a walk or stay physically active. And the other thing about physical activity is that it maintains the sensitivity of the muscle to the nutrition. So simply by staying active, even though in your head, you're not lifting, therefore I won't grow. But staying physically active retains muscle sensitivity to amino acids. So I think that's kind of another way to think about it as well, and the importance of physical activity.
I love that. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Just the physical activity. I'm sure you're also referring to insulin sensitivity, just the activity.
Yeah, so like sometimes people become pre-diabetic a little bit through physical inactivity, and one of the reasons is that your muscle is basically a sink. It's a sink for glucose and it's a sink for amino acids. And when you stay physically active, there's essentially receptors on muscle that become a little bit more active when you are physically active. So, mechanical kind of, I wouldn't say mechanical tension, but, mechanical strain in the form of exercise like walking around, that will activate those receptors on the muscle to bring in glucose and to bring in amino acids. And I think staying physically active keeps your muscle very healthy. It keeps the quality of your muscle healthy. So another way to think of things is just because our muscles may not necessarily grow, it doesn't mean that the quality of the muscle is not being positively affected. So, the more that you increase the synthetic rates of building that wall and the breakdown rates, you're constantly replacing that brick wall, right? So one way to think of it is if you've got damaged bricks, you want to knock them out and then you want to replace them. And that's what physical activity does. It increases the turnover of your tissue so that you're constantly replacing damaged or broken tissue. And essentially that's what physical activity does. And that's why it's so important.
And I noticed that you mentioned primarily resistance training. If you were going to choose one thing versus some kind of cardiovascular, why the resistance training over some kind of cardiovascular exercise?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say both, right? If I had to pick, I would
I agree.
pick both. I think both are important. But if someone had a gun to my head and said, you have to pick one, for me, it would be resistance training. And I think that will be because, the first thing I'd say, the majority of the literature out there on exercise and the overwhelming evidence is built upon the foundation of endurance exercise and cardiovascular exercise, of which there are clear benefits. But there's comparatively less work when it comes to resistance exercise training, particularly as we get older, and I think there's maybe some societal issues around older women typically performing resistance exercise as well. And some of the narratives around that, at least in their head, a little bit outside my area, but that's the experience I've had talking to some of the older women when they come in to do training. But I
What do
think
they
resistance
say? Do they say,
exercise,
I can't lift weights? I'm going to get
I
bulky.
don't
I'm
want to
going to
go to the
get
gym.
hurt myself. What do they
Yeah.
say?
Well, hurting ourselves is one, but the other one is I've just never done it. I've never seen myself in a gym. And I think a lot of that is they don't see themselves in the gym. And if you walk into the average gym, you can see, particularly in the weight section, that the demographics that are typically there versus, you don't walk into a weight section and typically see older ladies performing squats or doing that type of work. It's just not something that they've ever seen themselves doing. And I think it's really important to try to change that message, because they're probably, if you were to pick a demographic that you think will benefit the most from resistance training, it's the older adults, particularly the older women.
Absolutely. So I wrote a book called Forever Strong, and that's exactly what it's about.
Yeah.
It's really about changing the narrative surrounding resistance training, muscle health as not something that is just for the bros in the gym, but truly
Yeah,
has this burden
absolutely.
of longevity. And I appreciate you because what you're saying absolutely backs up that message. And again, as a geriatrician, that is what I hear is that women will say, well, I'm just not the kind of person that goes in and knows how to lift weights and feels comfortable. But it is the most
Yeah.
important, in my opinion, most important exercise that has to be instated. And also, what I'm hearing you say is that it doesn't have to be heavy weights. It probably could be, and again, Stu Phillips has done some wonderful work in this area, that it can be resistance bands, lighter weights. It doesn't have to be these heavy 1 rep max. Would you agree with that?
Ab- Absolutely, 100%. And I think it's a little bit of a myth that you need to lift this heavy weights. And I'll hold my hands up. When I first went to Stu's lab, I was like, no way. Like, you need to, in my mind, I was like, what's going on? I saw Nick Bird's work, excellent work, real good work with the protein synthesis. And I was like, nah, you've got to be lifting heavy weights. And my mind's changed. It significantly has changed over time. Like, when I first went, I had my PhD and I still was not convinced. And then, when I was there and I just started to think a little bit more kind of clearly about it. And I realized, and now the evidence is there, the meta-analyses are there. There's enough evidence to show actually you don't need heavy weights to grow muscle. And you certainly don't need heavy weights to to get stronger. Maybe if it's you want to get that extra 2% out and you're a power lifter or whatever, I get it. You want to practice that task at a heavy load. But if you're talking public health recommendations, and I think this is where there's a conflation between public health recommendations and what is optimal for an athlete. And I think in my mind, going to the gym, you don't have to do heavy weights. You don't have to do multiple set after set after set. If older folks want to go, they do. They can do low load till failure or even close to failure. You don't necessarily even need to go to failure. You can get significant health benefits from performing resistance exercise, and they occur quite quickly as well.
They do. They do. Now, I have a question for you. I don't know if this has been studied, but does the omega-3 affect different fiber types differently? Type 1 versus type 2? Is there more of a significant change or dose that affects one or the other?
I don't know. I don't think anyone's actually looked at that. I don't believe they have. I mean, the way to do that would be to do the biopsy and take the single fibers and then look at the differences in incorporation. I think I think we're splitting hairs at that point. If we do see the differences, it's more interesting from a biology point of view, but from an overall health point of view, I'm not too sure it would make that much of a difference. But the long and short there is that I just don't know.
Is there a, potentially a genetic variability in these effects?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is some work from the University of Toronto by somebody called Adam Metherell, and he's done some really really cool work in this field, looking at particular SNPs and genotypes. And there's some females that seem to be able to, or women, females that seem to be able to more effectively convert EPA to DHA. So when we talk about omega-3s, you consume them in the diet, but essentially you can convert EPA to DHA. And there seems to be some evidence that certain women can convert, not all women, but certain women can convert EPA to DHA a little bit more effectively or efficiently. And that's early level research. It's something that we certainly need to build upon. And we're in Sydney study right now. We're doing the feeding study, or the time course change, and we're going to try to tease that out a little bit. We're not statistically powered for the genotype work, but from an exploratory analysis, we're going to look at that. But I will say that not just from changes in the composition of the membrane, but the production of lipid species appears to be very variable to a single dose between people. But a little bit more work needs to be done there with that.
That is so amazing. So there may be variability in these effects based on male or female. That seems that women potentially can convert and utilize it more effectively. Would you say?
Yeah, well, essentially, it just seems to have higher resting DHA levels in the plasma. Whether it's the same in the muscle, I'm not too sure.
I see.
And that's something that we're interested in doing because we do the muscle biopsy research here. So that's something that we'd look at. But it's trying to understand like why does that happen? Like why do some people maybe metabolize these omega-3 fatty acids slightly different compared to other people? What are the reasons, and can that be leveraged from understanding the biology of omega-3s and also leveraged towards improving in health? I think that information is yet to come. But what I'll say is there's, in terms of muscle, and rightly so, there's just an abundance of research on essential nutrient in the form of protein, so the essential amino acids. But I think the role of these essential fatty acids in muscle is very much in its early stages, and there is a lot of exciting work still to come. Requires money, but
Yeah, it
it's on its
does.
way.
And it requires someone to do the biopsies. Did you have to do the biopsies, Chris?
Here, yes, we do. In Canada, we do the biopsies. Yep.
So, I
So
mean,
it's
you personally, because I had to do them early in the morning. I had to do fat and muscle
well,
biopsies early. So I'm just asking, are you the one that has to go in there and go, oh gosh, here we go?
at the moment, yes, but I'm trying to find my way to wiggle out of it. If I'm honest with you, to get somebody else to do them because it's not the early mornings, but it's just half your day's gone by the time that you finish doing them. It's 12 o'clock, and you're like, right, I got to start my day now. So
Yep.
this morning, I got the morning off from them, so I'm quite happy about that.
And your armpits are sweating and you're like, okay, because got to make sure that they're appropriately numbed
Yeah.
and, there's no infection. It's a whole thing. It is absolutely a whole thing.
I know I tell the same jokes every biopsy to the participant, and it's a different participant, so they don't mind. But the PhD students, again, I'm pretty bored of the same jokes every time. So,
It's so
but they just have to
funny.
deal with it.
Do you think that there's a role in omega-3 fatty acids in weight loss?
Um, it would be you would. It's a kind of a nuanced question in terms of if somebody was. Here's the way in which I think it could happen. If you were in a situation of to induce weight loss, you require a calorie deficit. Typically, when you're in a calorie deficit, you of course will lose fat, but you will also lose a little bit of skeletal muscle. Now, if it is the case that the omega-3s are potentiating the protein synthetic response to feeding, it could be the case that when you're in a situation of weight loss and you consume those omega-3s, that they would better help retain lean tissue during that weight loss period. To my knowledge, that question has not been comprehensively answered yet. It's a really interesting one, but then we get into the details, or sorry, into the so it's about the ability to detect a change, right? In obviously in science and the RCTs, and I think the effects of omega threes in muscle are typically very small. They can be very important and clinically meaningful, but they're very small. So I think to answer that question, we would need quite a large RCT to be able to detect the effect of omega threes in that context if it did exist.
You know, Nick Bird, he was actually at the University of Illinois. I don't know if he is still there.
Yeah.
There was some evidence that he had put out that potentially individuals struggling with obesity have somewhat of a a blunted muscle protein synthetic response. Have you also seen that
Yeah.
data? Seen that data from him? Um,
Yeah, I've not. I mean, I've not done any studies myself on that, but I've seen Nick's work on that, and they wrote a pretty good review on that in Frontiers as well. I mean, the literature is mixed, but it does seem to be the effect. Sort of defining that obese people do have that blunted response.
yeah, and it just makes me wonder: is this room for again utilizing omega-3 fatty acids with high quality protein to potentiate and overcome um, any challenges within that tissue? Because skeletal muscle tissue also gets fat infiltrated within the tissue. The quality of the tissue can change. Yeah, so I was just curious if you had thought about that, or if there was any research that you're aware of, or potentially something that you're working on related to obese tissue and omega-3 fatty acids.
No, not off the top of my head. I mean, it would be an interesting question though to answer is, could we do that? I think sometimes though, is it the case of, I mean, it would be a mitigation strategy as opposed to a frontline strategy, to try to kind of improve the quality of the muscle. But as a stopgap, so to speak, it would be maybe interesting to see whether you could increase the omega 3 content. I would assume though that those omega 3s are also going to get soaked up by some of the adipose tissue. So, when you're given an absolute dose of those omega 3s, how long would it take? And an interesting question is, does it differ in terms of the incorporation into muscle between obese and non-obese? But typically obese folks tend to have more muscle anyway. It's just the quality of the muscle is not great.
Right. Do you think, we talk about gram size, but is there um, a body weight component, a dose associated based on body weight? Because essentially someone, I'm 5'1", 110 pounds. I am going to have a lot less phospholipid membranes potentially than someone who is 6 foot, 250 pounds.
Yeah, and that's again a great question because some of the variability that we see could just simply be because we are given the same flat dose to people of different body masses, right? So the relative changes are going to be different. I think from a scientific perspective, it would be interesting to see whether we do prescribe things based on a gram per kilogram basis, like sometimes people would do with protein. But I also think from an application point of view to the general population, it becomes a little bit difficult. You wake up in the morning and then it's like, okay, how much do I weigh? Like, and you get each gram pill. You're not going to cut a fish oil pill in half. It tastes horrible. So I think that it's a case of, I think the absolute doses are probably the best way to go for now, so that we can actually understand what's going on and to see on a kind of population basis and a clinically meaningful level whether these changes are occurring, and then we can refine the doses to kind of maybe make it a little bit more prescriptive on a person by person basis. But right now, in my mind, is I think we just need to start with the big questions with the absolute dose, and then if we need to, not least from a practical perspective of giving people an oil on a gram per gram basis,
Hmm.
just stick with the absolute dose at the moment.
That's a really good perspective. Do you think that there is any role in the timing of omega-3 fatty acids in relation to exercise and recovery?
Okay, so if, again, I just go back to my initial hypothesis with this is that it's required to be incorporated into the membrane for it to see its effect. And that's one of the limitations that people will argue against omega-3s. If you're going into surgery and it's an emergency surgery or it's a last minute issue or you become sick last minute, then you're not exactly going to reap the benefits because it's going to take 2 weeks for it to get into the membrane, sometimes 4. So the way that and we're doing a study right now with ACL surgery patients where we are loading them up with high dose omega-3s and high dose essential amino acids to see whether that kind of prophylaxis approach can work. But I would say that in terms of timing, I don't believe that you could take omega-3s on a Monday and see the benefits on a Tuesday. That's just my particular
But it
view.
would be nice. So basically, if you guys are
Oh yeah, it would be
listening,
nice.
omega-3 fatty acids, so it'd be something that you would also potentially pre-take, not if, but when there's some kind of catabolic crisis or some kind of need. You mentioned essential amino acids. What is the dose comparison? And do you control for the dietary protein in the diet? Because I've seen some of your other studies, you double the RDA at 1.6 grams per kilogram. Do you, or was it, I think it was actually 1 gram. Yeah. How do you dose protein and then with the addition of these essential amino acids?
Yeah, so we typically put and this is something that we get review a lot with the grants because, it's, are you giving the essential amino acids on top of the diet or are you replacing what's already in the diet so that essentially the diet is of better quality, so to speak? In our studies, we add it on top. And that's because we want that big excursion of essential amino acids into plasma and potentially into muscle. And so that's when the design of the studies right now that we've got, just to give you an example for the surgery study, is they will consume a high dose essential amino acid product. It's around 20 grams of essential. It's a very high essential amino acid
Mm.
with the omega-3s, but the omega-3s are every morning and then the essentials are like twice a day to hopefully take advantage of that priming effect. So our doses are typically higher. We choose a pure essential amino acid mixture because, when people go to hospital, we want to be kind of careful of the calories if they are consuming enough calories. Some places they don't, but at least in our setting they do. And we don't want people to become overfed as opposed to, does that make sense? Like you don't want to induce negative effects in the muscle because you're overfeeding them.
Right.
So we try to balance it as much as we can.
And I really like that you pointed out this idea of overfeeding skeletal muscle because, again, skeletal muscle as this site for glucose disposal, if you do not create flux and exercise within this tissue, you do have to utilize muscle glycogen. If anyone were to Google intramyocellular lipids or ceramides, there's just all kinds of things that happen when skeletal muscle is overfed. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's, in terms of calorie control, 100%. You don't, when you start to get a surplus of calories for a prolonged period of time, you can start to see, like you said, in infiltration of fatty acids, not good fatty acids into muscle, the development of insulin resistance. And this is where exercise is a potent tool. And there is some evidence, I think Bettina Mittendorf has shown somewhere, you feed high doses of protein for too long, it is linked, at least whether it's causative, it's reverse causality, we don't know. There is a link between, these high dose protein diets and potentially insulin resistance, but that is completely abolished when you perform exercise. So in my mind, one thing, and actually I was talking to Nick Bird maybe 2 years ago, or whatever, about like when we teach nutrition in a university, and sometimes people would teach nutrition in the absence of exercise. But the reality is that physical activity modulates the fate of those ingested nutrients. So, if it's to understand nutrition, I think you need to understand how it's partitioned, or the dietary intake of those nutrients can be partitioned depending upon the physical activity status. So, if you're lying in a bed and you're not moving and glycogen stores are full, well, you know that those excess calories are probably going to get turned into lipids. But if you are exercising, the calories are likely going to either be stored as glycogen or turned to glucose or oxidized.
Yeah. And I want to follow up and mention something about the data with higher protein diets. Again, we would have to define that. But one of the things that I think should be pointed out is that you'll see an increase in all of these metabolites in the blood, whether it's glucose, whether it's fatty acids, whether it's these amino acids, not because at least from the data that I've looked at, not because it's a direct cause of these amino acids, but again, it's an overconsumption. You can't just add protein to an already calorie-rich diet and you're going to get a positive effect. That is not going to happen. You will see an increase in these substrates within the blood. And I do think that that's an important point to mention and to point out. Do you think that there is, beyond the amino acids, so we're really talking about something that is in its elemental form, the amino acids and then these omega-3 fatty acids, do you think that there are bioactive compounds that when these things are ingested, or at least from an omega-3 fatty acid standpoint, whether it's vitamin D, K2, do you think that there is some synergistic effect or other bioactive compounds that may influence this decrease in or blunting of this? I shouldn't say blunting, augmenting of the muscle protein synthesis and mitigating of proteolysis, which again is this highly regulated, complex system that degrades muscle proteins.
Yeah, I think so this is definitely not my specific area of expertise. So I am just pretty much going off. I probably know different to the lay public here, but essentially is Nick Bird's done some really good work with eggs where you give, intact like egg with yolk, and then you separate them off and you pretty much get a more positive effect when you consume an intact egg that contains its yolk. And Kevin Tipton, my old PhD mentor, he did work in Texas where it was like full fat milk versus I think skim milk or the isolated part of it. And weirdly, the full fat milk had a greater effect on positive protein balance. So in my mind, I think this is what was mentioned in Nick's papers, is that it is, it's greater than the sum of its parts in terms of that there are some things in intact food sources that would work together synergistically to enhance protein synthetic responses than simply isolating what are the so-called known active ingredients. So this is where I'd always suggest a food-first approach. When people say, should I take omega-3 supplements? I'd be like, well, can you not get it from oily fish? So that's what I would always suggest. And yeah, I think there are some bioactive compounds that would actually work together to enhance protein synthesis and modulate protein turnover, whether it be proteolysis as well. But exactly what they are, I don't know. I think there's a little bit more work to be done there. There's some evidence that vitamin D might work. But again, I'm not too familiar with that literature, but I do think it's a food first approach whenever we can, to try to take advantage of what seems to be an emerging theme in the literature, that when you combine intact food sources, there seems to be a better, let's just say, health benefit than consuming the isolated parts.
Thank you to First Form for sponsoring this episode of the show. This is a perfect place to highlight First Form's Full Mega. It is ultra concentrated EPA, DHA premium omega-3 formula. And just as Chris was talking, here is what is in 2 soft gels. EPA has 900 milligrams. So 2 soft gels contain 900 milligrams of EPA and 600 milligrams of DHA, which is exactly the dosage that Chris is talking about. We've heard all about why omega-3 fatty acids are very important, and that having both EPA and DHA are critical for the phospholipid and potentially even mitochondrial health. Super easy to use. Get ahead of it. And here's how you do it. Go to firstform.com/Dr. Lyon, pick Full Mega, drop it in your cart, and you get free USA shipping on your order over $75 or more. That's firstform.com/Dr. Lyon. It's exciting. It's exciting because ultimately you're utilizing these individual components, creating evidence information behind it, and then going back to the individuals, right? We are, and saying, okay, well, choose these whole foods that have these components in it to really optimize and protect it. It is ultimately using food as medicine and movement as medicine for optimization, which is incredible. Where is your research going? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So, right now we've got a surgery study. So we have patients going through ACL reconstruction, and we've created an essential amino acid drink, basically a bespoke drink that is based off the literature that we think will have the most anabolic influence, and we're combining that with omega-3 fatty acids. We've also got a bed rest study that's going to start early next year that's looking at the effect of a combination of essential amino acids and omega-3 fatty acids in that response. But, I think, the lab actually, omega-3s is what we're interested in, but primarily what we look at is the mechanisms that regulate protein turnover in response to disuse and exercise. So we have some other studies going on that look at using the biopsies at the proteomic response to exercise and muscle immobilization. So which particular proteins in the muscle are being synthesized and which particular proteins are being degraded. So we've got a new postdoc, John McGlory, who's come from Stu's lab, who's leading that with my master's student, Christine, and Emily Ferguson's leading the bed rest study. Emily's already wrote actually a really good review article on what she thinks is happening inside the muscle when it comes to omega-3s. And seems like we've got a lot going on, and it sounds like I'm name dropping, but I think the students need recognition for what we're doing
I
at the
agree with
moment.
you. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah,
And
Danny
we'll
Nyman's
link some
leading.
of those papers, as long as they're
Okay,
open access, but we'll link them either way. I agree with you. They do a lot of
Okay.
work.
Sorry.
No. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, it's a lot of work. That's the thing is with these types of trials is like they're 3 year trials sometimes before when you start to, when, the papers come out. And like, for example, right now, Danny Nyman's leading the surgery immobilization study. That's been in the works now for about a year, and just designing the protocol, working with the surgeons, getting the nutrition designed. And then, people will read a 4-page PDF, but it's probably like a few $100,000, thousands of hours of work that go into it, and it's kind of interesting when the paper gets published. It's more of a relief than anything else, to be honest, that you've managed to get it through.
Because Chris, let's be truthful. I mean, I worked on some papers during my postdoc. We worked on a project at 2 major projects that didn't get published.
Yeah.
And people
really?
don't recognize the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of dollars and full teams working on these studies. I mean, we were doing euglycemic clamps and muscle biopsies and cognitive testing and just an enormous amount of work, but it doesn't all get published.
When people say, when they do get published, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And I'm like, well, you write me a check for $1 million and I'll do whatever you want. Like we want to do these things, but they just cost money, and they cost time. So, but I'm sure it's all going to be helpful moving forward to kind of pinpoint things and to see what's going on with these omega-3 fatty acids, because it is very much a new and interesting area of research on top of, understanding the biology of muscle loss and muscle growth.
Well, Chris McGlory, I'm so grateful for your time. Let's close it out with your ultimate recommendation, the scientific recommendation, and then potentially your recommendation, and maybe they're one and the same, of whether it's a diet or supplementation. Putting you on the spot, buddy.
Okay, I'd say stay physically active and do a mixture of resistance exercise and endurance exercise. And that will be my primary recommendation. Then after that, if you can get yourself around 500 mg twice per week of EPA plus DHA, you're good to go. But primarily exercise.
I love it. And how much dietary protein are you recommended these days?
Oh, I don't think you need much more than around 1.2 grams per kilogram, if I'm honest.
Okay. All right.
If you're training heavy, 1.6, but anything, it depends. If you're an older person, anyway, I'm going off into it depends. My answer is it depends, but I'd say the general public, anything above 1.2 is pretty much not diminishing returns at that point in my mind. Unless you're doing heavy training, then maybe 1.6.
Okay. So I'm going to hold you to a 1.6. I think that higher from a clinical perspective may be better because, again, they're going to either get carbohydrates or fats. And there's so many benefits to these amino acids and the foods that ride along with it, whether it's creatine and serine, all the other things, iron. But a whole foods diet, I love it. And you're also not saying that you have to take omega-3 supplementation, that if you're getting really 2 servings a week, you would feel good about that.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and absolutely. I don't think, I'm not here trying to peddle you need to supplement with omega-3s at all. I think if we're just trying to find nuanced kind of situations in which it may benefit, but I think for the general population, a food-first approach with oily fish, that'll do the job.
Well, I love it. Chris McGlory, I'm so grateful for you. And I know that the listeners are going to absolutely love this. And in this episode, we covered everything related to omega-3 fatty acids and skeletal muscle health. And where can people find you if you want them to find you? Are you looking for new
That's
graduate students?
it. Yeah, well, we're always looking for good graduate students and good postdocs. I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's the closest you're going to get me to social media, unless I reserve Facebook for me ranting when rugby scores don't go my way. But other than that, LinkedIn professionally, and also you can contact me via email as well.
Well, thank you, Chris, again.
Yeah, no worries. And thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed the chat. Always good to kind of talk over these things with other people who have share the interest.
Yes. All right, guys, till next time, I hope you love this episode of the show. As always, please take a moment, rate, review, share it. And this content is free. The goal is that we get the best of the best out there to interface with you all.